Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to ASPI. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge some of our great diplomatic corps. We've got the High Commissioner from the UK, Sarah McIntosh. We've got Lithuania's ambassador to Australia, Darius Degutis, and I think we've got a few others who I can't quite see directly, but welcome to you and senior members of the Australian public service industry and civil society. Great to have you with us today here at ASPI. This is a recorded event on the record. It will be posted in the morning, but it is on the record. Mark is happy to not just involve himself with a set of questions back and forth with me, but we'll come to you guys about halfway through. So think about some tough questions while
not
we're...
the High Commissioner.
Not from the High Commissioner, she's banned. From the ambassador. Get ready for the Lithuanian ambassador's questions. With that, it is a real pleasure to welcome Lord Mark Sedwill to ASPI and to Canberra.
Justin, great to be here.
Wonderful. It's been a few years since you and I have seen each other after crossing paths in our respective Prime Minister's offices. Mark's full resume would take me the entire afternoon to get through, but just quickly, amongst his many influential roles, he was the UK's ambassador to Afghanistan from 2009 to 2010, as well as the NATO senior civilian representative in Afghanistan, the permanent Under-Secretary of State at the Home Office from 2013 to 2017, the National Security Advisor to two Prime Ministers from 2017 to 2020, and I think the first and only person to have been simultaneously the NSA and the Cabinet Secretary and Head of Civil Service from 2018 to 2020. He carried out these dual roles during the first Trump administration, and shortly after becoming NSA in 2017, initiated a national security capability review in the UK, through which he formed what was known as the Fusion Doctrine, involving the interlocking of economics, security and society. And this is where I'd like to start with Mark today. Again, Mark, welcome here.
Thanks, Justin. Great to be with you.
Could you, for our audience and our viewers online, set out the Fusion Doctrine that you formulated and then led as NSA from 2017-2018? What is it, why you felt it was a necessary part of a national security strategy, and what were the practical steps involved in implementing it?
Well, thank you very much. It was essentially, Justin, great to be here, and thank you very much. The central insight, I guess, of what we called the Fusion Doctrine is if you want to be effective in national security, you have to recognise it's a team sport. And that means bringing together diplomacy and development and defence within government, communications, all of the other elements as well, trade policy and so on. But it also means engaging beyond government with the private sector, the third sector, civil society, and so on. And doing that in a way that recognises that Western democracies have a multiplicity of objectives. So we have national security objectives, core defence of the realm, protection of the citizen and so on. We have economic objectives, and we have wider societal objectives. And if you're a country like the UK, member of the Security Council, you also want to influence and shape the international system. And so the key discipline is, in effect, getting everyone to recognise not only is a team sport, but it's a team sport in which they have to support other goals than their own natural goals. So it's getting the national security community to recognise that part of their job is to care about economic issues, and the economic departments of government and the private sector to recognise they have some responsibility for national security and resilience, and so on and so forth. Now, to be honest with you, Justin, I mean, I love to take credit for the whole thing, but it was really an evolution of a process that had started some years before. The UK has actually always been quite good at joined-up government. Tony Blair used that language, 15 years before we developed the doctrine. So it was always building on what had come before. We'd formed a National Security Council and a National Security Secretariat in government back in 2010. But one of the frustrations I think successive prime ministers had was that there'd be a good collective discussion at the National Security Council, at which the whole of government essentially agreed on an approach, But then the individual departments kind of went off and then did their own thing rather than necessarily actually all getting behind that. And so this was partly designed to reimpose, if you like, the discipline of turning a good collective ministerial discussion into genuinely collective governmental action, rather than every department then thinking, well, okay, we'll just carry on doing our own thing. And that is actually, if anything, I think even more important today than it was at that time. We were dealing with a Russian threat then. We had the Salisbury attack and other issues of that kind, but we also used it on issues like what is the UK's strategy in Africa, and of course what is the UK's strategy towards China, and how does one manage the economic and the security imperatives, which are often in tension, and make sure that our position is coherent. And of course, that's as true, if not more true, in 2025 than it was in 2018 or indeed in 2010.
So that recognition by government that governments can't do everything alone, they've got to work with industry and civil society, that bringing together all aspects of a nation. There's an interesting balance we wouldn't mind teasing out with you, the differences and similarities between democracies, authoritarian regimes. At the time, there were some critics of the Fusion Doctrine accusing you almost of becoming more like the Russians and learning from Russia's hybrid warfare strategy that, again, used all aspects of society and fused, like China has fused its military and civil society. The Russians used all aspects of society to achieve their malign objectives. So what's your answer, Mark, in that? How do democracies ensure that the different sectors working together is done so to protect individual rights and freedoms, and doesn't become an authoritarian version of fusion which endangers individual rights for the protection of the party political state?
Sure. Well, that criticism was sometimes made. I guess there's a two-part answer. One is we shouldn't be ashamed of learning from our adversaries. If they do things effectively, then we do need to understand that and learn from that. And as you say, the Russians are very capable exponents of hybrid conflict, and we need to be willing to deploy those same techniques against our adversaries as well, because otherwise we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back. And this is particularly important in the modern era, where so much of the challenge is happening in what national security professionals often refer to as the grey zone, as you and I both know it. So that zone between normal interaction between states within a rules-based international system and armed conflict. And we see that with the Russians all of the time, seeking to disrupt elections, seeking to undermine the democratic systems of Western countries. And I certainly take the view that if they're going to do it to us, we should be willing to do some of those same things to them. But of course, it has to be aligned with our values. And the very simple answer to your question is, in the end, it's all under democratic control. The people who make the decisions in our system are the National Security Council. That is a cabinet committee. It's chaired by the Prime Minister. The decision makers are ministers and government. They set the rules. The job of the professionals is to give them the best advice we can and then to implement faithfully the decisions that they take. And sometimes we'll go to them and say, well, the security interest is this, or the core economic interest is that. And ministers will be the ones to say, yeah, but actually we care as much or more about some values issues, or we want the human rights questions to be more prominent in your thinking. And that tension is both real and welcome. That is why we have political leaders. It's their job to say, yes, no, here are the boundaries, whatever the security professionals or the economic, those thinking about the economic interests are. And that's how you make sure that in the end, fundamentally, we're defending our own democratic freedoms. One of the questions we had to address on the resilience side was, in the modern era, you've got to think of national security quite broadly. You've got to think about not only the defence of the realm and non-state threats like terrorist threats and criminal groups and so on, but you've got to think about economic security. And of course, we've also understood we have to think about democratic security. How do we protect our democratic system against malign attempts to undermine it? You've got to be really, really careful at how you step into that space for obvious reasons, and make sure that the impartial professional service, which is deliberately non-partisan, non-party political, and holds very dear to those underlying constitutional principles, loyalty to the Crown, not just to the government, etc., but also the political imperatives are brought together in a way that protects those rights. But fundamentally, we're under democratic control, and that's the best protection you can have in our system.
So is it too simple to say that we need a democratic form of fusion
Yes,
of all
absolutely.
sectors to protect ourselves from the authoritarian form of fusion?
Yeah, exactly. The other thing to remember is the authoritarian form of this generally subordinates everything else to the security interests of the state, whether that's protecting themselves against their own population, as it sometimes is, or whatever ambitions they have for the hard security of the state. And the point we were trying to make was we have to blend, we as democracies, as pluralistic societies, we have blended objectives. Yeah. We care about national security, we care about prosperity, we care about influence, we care about the rules-based system, we care about our civil society and civil values. And so it's more complex for us because we can't say everything is subordinated to security, because it can't be. Security is important, but it's important within parameters. And therefore, we have to manage that complexity. But as I say, by doing so, I think we can bring a wider range of capabilities to bear, including civil society, in a way that the authoritarian states can't.
So having to manage it, who would you say is managing this, whether you call it fusion or ensuring that the sectors are all working together in a form of harmony with their different interests? But who amongst the democratic countries is doing well compared to, say, how well it seems on the face of it China's fused model, military civil fusion, government industry together, all aiming for the objectives of the state? Are we, as any democracies that you are looking at, doing this form of democratic fusion well?
Well, I think the UK genuinely does it well. There is a sort of a strong imperative in UK public service to recognise that fundamentally we're team players and it's a team sport, and we need to work across the inherent structural silos that exist in government. There are others, particularly those countries where there's essentially an overriding issue, a security threat and so on, which naturally do it well, but that's partly, again, because they can subordinate other imperatives to the security threat or whatever it might be. And it's easier in smaller places. So we have Lithuania ambassador here. If I look at some of the Baltic states, actually they do bring their society together very well. But of course, they're smaller countries, smaller societies. Everyone knows each other in a way. Finland does it very well. So I think you've got to just recognise there are differences here. You could argue the country that does it least well in an organised sense is the United States, because it's a federated system, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, if you look at the effect that they have, the extraordinary ability of that economy to evolve, the dominance of their tech giants and so on in the sector, as a nation, without trying to organise it, they have an extraordinary effect. And so you've got to think about what's right for your country, the way your national institutions work. We have a unitary system, you have a federated system. You've got to just do things that work with the grain of your own system.
So if the Americans have been able to largely do it well, almost without thinking about it, very entrepreneurial, working towards a very patriotic society as a whole, is it the case, though, now that we can no longer hope that it'll just happen for us, that the US will stay as a leader of the democratic world no matter what we do? Is it the case now that we have to actually try and we have to have structures in place? But how do we have, you mentioned that it might be easier for some smaller countries, but if you have a look at the UK and Australia and even the US, how do we bring a form of economic security and society and technology together if we are dependent on the countries, whether it be China or Russia, for our economies and technology? We become dependent on the very countries that are the ones doing us harm. in those areas?
So I think there are two parts to that, Justin. The first is that what I think has become even clearer now than it was at the time that we developed this idea is one of the assets is allies. So I mentioned the security, economic, diplomatic, private sector, civil society, but there's another one, which is our allies. And actually I see what I've always thought of as AUKUS, which we sort of began the work on in my time, and you had Stephen Lovegrove, my successor, who negotiated the actual agreement itself. But I've always seen that formal agreement of AUKUS as the start of something much bigger, which you could describe as essentially a fusion approach, pick your word, but a fusion approach, particularly between the UK and Australia, as allies of the United States. And will be more effective allies of the United States. I heard an senior American military officer tell me this just recently when I was having a day up on Talisman Sabre, if we're more effective together, because together we can create greater critical mass and be more effective partners and allies to the United States. So I see AUKUS as being kind of a fusion concept more broadly, and I think we need to think about that not just in our militaries and intelligence, but our economic security and so on as well. And that is essentially the answer to the second part of your question. We all have major economic interests in China. China is the world's second largest economy. That isn't going to change anytime soon. Of course, a huge trading partner for Australia, big trading partner for the UK, but it's also the biggest trading partner for the United States outside the NAFTA area. And it is, by the way, in the world's interest that that continues. I mean, we need those major economies operating on the world stage. We've got to engage China on climate change. We've got to engage them on many of these other issues. We'll do so most effectively if we do so as a team.
Yeah.
That Australia, Canada, others have felt pretty isolated from time to time when China has chosen to put pressure on us as individuals. We had it over the Dalai Lama early in David Cameron's time as Prime Minister. You had it over Australian businessmen detained in China. The Canadians have the same problem and so on. But if we concert, the Americans, of course, are big enough to deal with this alone. But for the rest of us, if we concert, if we operate as a team, if we say these are the boundaries, yes, of course, we all have economic interests in China, but there are also boundaries that we're simply not going to accept China should cross, and we're going to contain China on those issues. Then operating as a team, we can be effective. And we can be effective, of course, with the United States, but we can also be effective if the rest of us band together when the United States, for whatever reason, chooses not to be engaged. And so that's why I think in this modern, acutely so with Russia, but in a sense, that's the issue with Russia is different because Russia is economically insignificant, but an acute threat. China is a much more complex set of challenges because it's a country with which we have to engage as well, and we'll do so most effectively if we do so as a team. By the way, the Chinese will also, given the nature of their system, will also find that actually the predictability that comes from that easier to manage.
Do you think that when you refer to countries like Australia at times feeling a bit alone when feeling and under coercive pressure, you mentioned that we've got the Lithuanian ambassador here. I think Australia and Lithuania began to get closer in our bilateral relationship when we were the ones suffering economic coercion at the hands of China a few years ago. Do you think that the world has now, despite it being on fire, wars and conflict around the world, do you think we've seen a shift in recent years where Australia's view of China, Lithuania's view of China, is now shared by, for example, the EU or NATO, in part because of how close China is to Russia? Have we seen that shift?
Yeah, I think it's partly that, but it's also, as you've said, China's own behaviour. It has become more authoritarian and more assertive over the past decade, and certainly the EU now as a whole, and again, Lithuanian ambassador will know this well, uses language about China and the risks from China, which is much more reminiscent of the kind of language that Australia, the UK, and others were using even only a few years before, but also still want to set some boundaries and guardrails to that relationship that still enable us to cooperate and still enable us to maintain a strong and in some cases deeper economic relationship, but not a dependent relationship. or if it is dependent, it's going to be mutually dependent. And I chaired a panel for the G7 back in 2021 on economic security and resilience. And one of the key conclusions we came to from that was that the G7 plus our natural allies, Australia, South Korea, others beyond it. By the G7, by the way, I mean the US, the EU, really, plus then UK, Japan, Canada, etc. So the big Western economic blocs plus the big independent advanced economies like ours, that we need to show solidarity against economic coercion. And in doing so, and I pointed out at the time that Australia and Canada both felt pretty alone during those episodes. But if, in doing so, then we can set guardrails that even a country as powerful as China, and indeed countries who are growing in power, would have no choice but to respect. Yeah. That doesn't mean you have to be in an adversarial relationship. What it does mean is you have to understand that it's a regime with a very different value set and different objectives and ambitions, but by setting guardrails, by being coherent as allies with each other, it's a relationship that is eminently manageable in their interests as well as ours.
You talk about government being the one to have to set the guardrails, of course, and that's right. But you also talk about a true national security strategy involving the nation as a whole and society. Where do you see, Mark, in a national security strategy, where do you see the role of the government's communication with the public? Can a nation be fused or working together for its collective security without an informed society in 2025? The reason I ask is I think we are at risk as democracies of only telling the public the truth when the threats don't risk our economic prosperity. And so that there is a willingness by democratic governments to publicly critique Russia in 2025 because, as you said, they are now far less economically important than they were. We are willing to have an open conversation with the public about the Middle East, Gaza, no matter the relationships, the bilateral relationships. We are able to have a conversation about North Korea's involvement in Russia's war on Ukraine in a way that we don't seem to have a regular conversation about how China is actually the main enabler of Russia's war on Ukraine. So can we do two things at once? Can governments say, well, we have to have that economic relationship with China, but we are without saying to the public, be aware that there are risks here because strategically we aren't aligned?
Well, I think certainly in the UK, if you actually look at our national security strategy and then the communications around it, we do exactly as you said. We do talk in those terms. We don't use the same language about China as we do about Russia because the issue is different. And as I've said, there are issues on which it's important to engage and work with China, and it's in both our interest to have an economic relationship. The EU did the same, talking about China in those terms. We describe in our defence review China as the pacing threat because China's defence technological innovation means that really for the first time since the early period of World War II, the West can no longer take for granted we'll have a technological edge to offset the mass that our potential adversary can bring, and we need to be conscious of that. So actually, I think certainly among the informed commentariat in the UK, I guess it's the same here. There are no illusions about the challenge. There's a lot of articles and commentary written on exactly this and about how do we manage the tensions between those different elements of our relationship with China, and an understanding that is complex. It isn't as acute a threat as certainly we face in Europe from Russia. They've invaded another country. They're constantly threatening us. But that there is a threat there from China. That their values are different and antagonistic to ours. But that we also have to work with China in those areas. I think actually the public understand that pretty well. Your basic point, though, is we do need to communicate with the public. And I think one of the things that it is striking that is sort of somewhat absent from the political debate in most Western countries is it going to be possible to continue to pursue the social welfare model at the same time as increasing investment in defence? You don't really hear the language of sacrifice in the way that, if you think back, the most famous inauguration speech, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That kind of sentiment is absent in modern politics, but I think it's going to have to come back again.
Yeah, no, it's well said, and absolutely the facts of the economic relationship with China means that it is different to Russia. I suppose I think that we waited effectively, the world waited until Russia invaded Ukraine to say, well, we're not going to have Nord Stream, not going to have this type of dependency on Russia. So it wasn't necessarily the case that we treated Russia differently to China. We treat them both the same, trying to get as much out of them as possible for our economic part of the society.
Up to a point, Nord Stream is a fair example, but actually several countries were saying at the time, this is a mistake, including, of course, the United States. And, of course, we became acutely conscious of that. But I think we've also got to remember that whatever, as I said, it's an authoritarian state, completely different value set to ours, but it is not in our interests to push China even further away into a more adversarial relationship with Western countries. And I think one of the things that's easy to miss is that although there's quite a lot of talk about a second Cold War and the Thucydides trap and so on, actually the United States and China are managing their competition pretty skillfully. If you think back to the Cold War, almost any regional conflict, including some that were utterly irrelevant to their core security interests in Africa or Latin America or wherever else it was, brought the United States and Soviet Union kind of toe-to-toe into opposition. And if you actually look at the crises going on in the world right now, Ukraine, the Middle East, the wars across Africa, where the United States and China clearly have different interests and perspectives on them, they've actually managed to avoid even serious tension, let alone confrontation over those. And I think we should have some confidence that both Beijing and Washington are highly rivalrous, highly competitive. There's going to be a lot of rhetoric against each other, but they are also determined to avoid, whether deliberately or inadvertently, finding themselves drifting into confrontation or conflict. And I've seen examples where allies of theirs have used language that could have taken them in that direction, and both countries have pushed back and made clear that that isn't something that they want to happen. So I think we have to understand the superpowers are managing their relationship, so far at least, pretty well.
Okay. I hope you're right, not just so far, but longer term. You mentioned the managing of the US-China relationship. Management of the US relationship. Obviously, you were NSA during Trump's first term. It seemed at the time, in the first term, that the Quad countries, the Indo-Pacific Quad, Australia, Japan, India, were the three countries who didn't just manage the Trump administration, but strengthened their respective and their collective relationship with the US. I think there was probably a level of people thinking that, well, it's going to be another fait accompli. Those Quad countries are going to be the ones to manage the relationship best again, and poor old Europe is going to suffer. It seems like, though, in Trump's second term, that Europe, in many respects, notwithstanding some rhetoric, Europe has fared a lot better than the first term. We had a very successful NATO meeting, and in fact, it's the Quad countries, India, Delhi, Canberra, Tokyo, that are having some tensions that didn't exist that first term. What lessons do you think the UK in particular took from Trump's first term that has kept them in good stead for the second term? Or do you think that it's less about the lessons from the first term and then we're in a completely different term? We're not Trump's second term, it's a new term that requires just a completely different approach.
So I think there are elements of both of that. Of course, the UK does have an advantage in that President Trump himself has a strong affection for the country. We've just seen him up at his one of his golf courses in Scotland, and so that was always an element that was to our advantage. And I think, of course, the second term is different to the first. I mean, he's the first president to be re-elected after a gap since the end of the 19th century, and has come in having essentially had a break and very well prepared for government, and absolutely determined to deliver his agenda. You can argue about the pros and cons of what he's trying to do, but absolutely determined to use the power of the presidency, strengthen the power of the presidency, and deliver that agenda. But the fundamentals, at least for those outside the United States, are broadly speaking the same. He believes deeply in America first, and he believes that America's allies, European and Pacific, have essentially taken advantage of the American security umbrella and haven't essentially had a reciprocal relationship, shared the burden, taken advantage of the United States economically as he sees it. Now, I would argue with that. I don't agree with him. But he does have a point on the security side. And indeed, he's not the only American to have said that. He just says it in characteristically vivid terms and language in a way that other Americans don't. But for many presidencies, there's been deep frustration with the Europeans, for example, for not spending enough on defence and doing enough in our own defence. Why has there been a successful NATO summit? Well, because the Europeans took it seriously, and we agreed to raise our defence expenditure to 3.5% of GDP, which was the demand from Washington. By the way, if you see the Russian threat, that is what it should be, or arguably more, and of course 5% if you include expenditure on improving national resilience and so on alongside defence. That is, by the way, the right thing to do. It may have taken the catalyst of pressure from the Trump administration to get us there. It is the right thing to do because Europe has not been doing enough in that area. And actually, the parts that aren't in the headlines is we've also agreed to integrate more effectively to ensure our military capability actually delivers genuine military effect. In the first Trump term, I mean, I recall I came to this region more in my first year. I actually went to Beijing more in my first year than I went to Washington as National Security Advisor, partly because I needed to develop relationships I didn't yet have, but partly because there was an acute threat at the time from North Korea, which of course became a major preoccupation for that first Trump administration. And Japan and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, felt acutely anxious about that threat and were getting language from Washington at that time, which was very reminiscent of the language we heard in Europe, which is why do we have so many troops stationed there? Why are they not paying for them? Why do we have such a trade deficit with these countries that we are protecting? And then had to respond to that. So it's very early in the second Trump term. Europe has so far managed to address the substance of what he's demanding, what other American presidents have demanded. Japan, Korea, Australia, India, etc. Well, let's see where it settles. Yeah. But undoubtedly, we'll have to demonstrate that they are willing to do enough for their own defence, enough to share the burden with the United States and to align with the United States in order that he sees that it is in America's interests to continue to provide the assurance that he provides them, that the United States has traditionally provided for them.
No, I agree with that. There was a very important announcement yesterday from the Australian government around a frigates deal between Australia and Japan, which goes to that. Wouldn't mind throwing to the audience, so there are roving mics, but just as I get you to think about your questions, a final one that relates to one of your current roles. You are the chair of a great think tank, who we are very friendly with here, of course. IISS runs world-class conferences like the Shangri-La Dialogue. How do you, as the chair of the board, how do you ensure that the think tank itself maintains its vital independence in an era where independence isn't perhaps as respected as it once was?
So I think, certainly what we've found at IISS, and I've only just become the chair of the board. I've been a trustee for a little while and involved with them for a very long time for the same reasons as you. Is that actually is to continue to make the argument that the benefit of that kind of institution comes from being genuinely independent. Now, you've got to be dispassionate and thoughtful in the way that we do that, but actually we would simply lose all of our equity if we lost that fundamental dispassionate independence that we've always prized. And actually, over its history, IISS has come under pressure from time to time, as all think tanks do, particularly in one that's as active in organising these big international diplomatic dialogues and so on, and has always just maintained that this is, we're going to hold true to those underlying values. And actually, we haven't found that difficult. The trustees as a whole are absolutely committed to it, but so are all of the academic staff and so on as well. And it's just sort of deep in the DNA of the organisation. And to be fair, I'm not sure IISS would like me to say that, but it's true of RUSI, it's true of Chatham House, it's true of equivalent institutions elsewhere. It's just part of the DNA of those organisations. And I don't think anyone would ever want to see that diluted, because even if in the short term it might remove some heat from one direction or another, in the long term it would be devastating to the reputation and position of those institutes.
Excellent. All right. I see a couple of hands already.
Thanks, Justin, for spotting me next to the pillar. You and Graham with ASPI, formerly with IISS as well. Thank you, Lord Sedwill.
We stole him.
Well, hopefully you would endorse what I just said about the DNA of the organisation.
We could have another conversation about that later on, if you like. I just want to ask about it's a Brexit question, but it's not a gotcha Brexit question. You can tell by the accent. I've seen it from the inside as well. But really, I'm interested in how that connects to the fusion strategy that you've outlined and the influence that it's had on UK foreign policy making, external statecraft. Especially here in Australia, I think there's a view that it was ruinous and that's it, sort of end of story. But it occurs to me that the impact on foreign policy making is more subtle than that. It forced a higher risk tolerance on the UK. I think it also forced an integrated view of prosperity and security as twin sides of the same coin, and that's partly for necessity. We have to go and find trade elsewhere. And I think it's also lifted the profile of the Indo-Pacific within the UK for the obvious reason that the money has to be found that was not there before from Europe. But to put that sort of back on an Australian audience, for example, I don't think on the risk tolerance side that AUKUS, for example, would have happened if the UK was in the EU, because I think the conversation would have been about damage to the French relationship, and that probably would have won the argument. Those are just my views. I'd be interested in how now, nearly 10 years on, you see that in retrospect. But not was it right or wrong, but what's the impact the influence that it's had on the UK foreign policy making?
Thank you, Ewan. It's a great question. I agree with a lot of the premise that you set out for that question. I was clear as we developed the Fusion Doctrine. Of course, it was after Brexit. After the referendum, before we implemented, we were still negotiating the Brexit settlement. But essentially, I remember when I talked to ministers about this at the time, I said, look, I've always believed we should do this. I think it's in our interest that we operate this way. But I think now with Brexit, we simply no longer have the luxury of not doing it. We've got to operate this way now, because obviously we're now operating in a much more independent world. We're offshore, et cetera, et cetera. Even though at the time, the economic settlement with the EU was uncertain. I think you're also right, by the way, that it enabled us to use our assets as a major security player in support of our economic objectives. So if I think one of the things we were doing during the Brexit negotiation process was seeking to roll over the trade agreements we had with other countries around the world, Japan, Australia, et cetera, that they'd reach with the EU, and just essentially maintain continuity in those until we were no longer part of the EU, and then could, if you like, all of us get around to saying, okay, is this the right trade agreement? Do we want to have a new one? And so on, as of course we now have with Australia, we now have with India. But in that immediate period, to roll forward the arrangements that had been agreed with the EU. And several of those countries, you just said, yep, okay, great, you're an ally of ours, let's do that. But others particularly thought, well, hold on, we had to make a whole load of concessions in dealing with an economic bloc as big as the EU that we probably wouldn't have to make if we negotiated a free trade deal with the UK. So let's not necessarily roll it forward. Let's see if we can actually have a renegotiation. And part of what we were able to use, actually implicitly as much as explicitly, in forestalling a process that at the time we simply wouldn't have had the capacity to do at the same time as negotiating Brexit, was to remind those countries that we were a major security ally, and actually, not that that was something that would ever end, but it was in their broader interest to maintain that relationship with us, and therefore be not seek to be transactional on the economic and trade side in the very short term, and then we'd get back to thinking about what our new free trade arrangements might be like in longer term. So it was definitely that fusion approach, thinking about that as one set of assets, if you like, was definitely a part of being able to deal with those kind of pressures beyond the EU. AUKUS, I'm not sure I do agree quite with that. I think the handling of it would have been different. I mean, clearly the abruptness of the shift from the French to the US and British submarine element in Pillar 1 was very traumatic is probably overstating it, but certainly deeply disruptive, deeply annoying to the French, and disruptive of the Franco-Australian relationship at the time. I think the handling of that would have probably been different. But I think the underlying imperative that Australia needs a nuclear submarine capability, that there's a very strong 3 of the 5 Eyes imperative to deepen our cooperation on defence and tech and so on, given the context that Justin and I were exploring. I think all of those things were true whether or not the UK was in or outside the EU. And of course, we'd always been pursuing deeper military cooperation with Australia, deeper military cooperation with the United States anyway. So I think AUKUS might well have happened, but it would probably have been handled differently than if we were still members of the EU. And of course, now that some of those frictions have sort of dissipated somewhat, those political frictions have dissipated somewhat, we're doubling down on AUKUS, but also increasing our defence collaboration with some of our key EU partners, including the French. And we just had a very successful state visit by President Macron. So I don't think it was ever an either or, but I accept. I mean, clearly the handling would have been different in different circumstances.
Thanks, Mike. Just to, I suppose, give 2 cents worth on AUKUS for me, in terms of how we got there. I think it's a personal view that if we hadn't got together as 3 countries to have the same outcome on the 5G debate that was happening, I don't think we would have had AUKUS.
Maybe that may well be right.
Pete Anstey in the room, who was in Malcolm Turnbull's office at the time that 5G was being. I think that, interestingly, the bit of the division between the 3 countries that was happening at the time, once we got ourselves together there, it was there was an alignment there that was in.
Well, I think the 5G debate showed us that actually that kind of friction wasn't in our interests. Yeah. And so there was a sort of, okay, let's not do that again. Let's make sure that we are aligned on these things.
Ambassador.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. I read the report 2 days ago from Berlin, from Germany. It says only 16% of Germans would definitely be willing to defend their country, Germany, with weapons in case of a military attack, according to a new poll released on Monday. The poll was released with the German Public Opinion Forum Institute. It also mentions that clear majority, 59% of Germans, indicated they would probably not or definitely not be prepared to defend Germany if attacked militarily. Among this reluctance among women was even higher, 72%. Allow me to ask the first question. What is the mood in Britain, in UK, whether you would be willing to defend UK if military attacked? And another question, would you be willing to defend the Baltic states? I know that there is a UK brigade in Estonia, and of course we have a German brigade, so it's also quite interesting, not about the British citizens or German citizens willing to defend Germany or UK, but
whether the percentage would be much lower probably if anybody would ask if they would be able to defend the Baltic states. Yet another question. We live, of course, in a very dangerous time. We do have existential threats: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Despite the fact that UK is not a EU member, but at the same time, UK had already had a very dynamic relations with Germany. Of course, you signed the friendship treaty, of course, with France as well. UK is also aiming to intensify trilateral cooperation with Germany and France. On the other hand, European Union is still the system which builds on finding consensus and avoiding conflict. Now, as never before, Europe needs to implement urgent actions. Would you believe that Europe, EU as well, without NATO and US, is able to understand that coexistence with Putin's Russia and Xi's China is impossible, and that Europe must be powerful to defend its freedom? Thank you.
Two very big questions. So I don't know the poll that you refer to, Ambassador, and I think one has to be cautious sometimes because those polls can often be quite skewed by the nature of the question. But I do recall, partly because I was involved in the anniversary debate, that in the mid-1930s there was a very famous debate in the Oxford University Union, which was essentially this House would not fight for king and country, and the motion passed, and was it wasn't an opinion poll, it was a great shock that essentially the next generation of what people saw as the leaders of the nation had said that. And of course, many of the people who spoke in that debate actually did go on, of course, then to fight in World War II. So I think one has to be quite cautious of hypotheticals of that kind. I'm pretty confident in the UK actually those numbers would be orders of magnitude higher, because we have a very strong societal tradition of defending ourselves, and there's a very strong view actually in the UK that defence starts at NATO's eastern border, including the Baltics, but also Finland, etc. And it's for the very simple reason that we recognise that if the Russians are able to attack one NATO country now, then it will be us tomorrow or the day after. And so I genuinely think the reason we have that enhanced forward presence is in order to create that clear tripwire deterrent to the Russians to say the Baltic states are not on their own, and if you take on one of the Baltic states, you are taking on the whole of NATO, and the UK absolutely in the vanguard of that. Let's not forget as well, the UK's nuclear deterrent is a NATO nuclear deterrent. It's the only one that is actually dedicated to NATO. We have an independent, it can be used independendly, but it is fundamentally under the command of the Supreme Allied Commander and would be used as part of the NATO set of assets were it ever necessary to do so. So it's deeply in the UK system to have that NATO defence. I think in a sense that's the answer to your second question as well. It doesn't necessarily mean without the US, but it is absolutely right that European NATO, I think that's the way to think about it, is capable of defending ourselves should we face a threat from Russia. I wouldn't, by the way, agree with the point that we can't coexist with China for the reasons that Justin and I were discussing earlier on. I think we have to coexist with China. It doesn't mean we coexist on their terms. We've got to coexist on our terms. We've got to coexist with China. And of course, in a sense, we have to coexist with Russia because they are there. But what we have to do is constrain the threat from Russia and ensure that they can't disrupt our security any further, and that they pay a very significant price if ever they try to do so. But of course, European NATO needs the wherewithal to defend ourselves. Should the United States either decide, because at some point in the future there's an isolationist government in the United States, or be forced because they have a major security crisis in the Pacific and simply don't have the resources to be effective in two theatres at once, that should they not be able to get as engaged militarily, were we to face a threat in Europe. And so European NATO, that's why European NATO not only needs to build up our defence capability, but integrate it more effectively. It would still be under Sakhar's command. That general should still, or admiral or whatever, that commander should still be an American. And as we found in 2011 when we conducted the operation in Libya, we would still need American intelligence, American enablers, and all the rest of it. But one could envisage circumstances where the Americans didn't have military forces directly engaged in a particular incident or conflict, and where the Europeans did, if, as I say, for example, they needed to be elsewhere, but where they were providing enablers, special forces, other elements of that kind. And certainly European NATO needs to have that capability. And we need to have that capability as well, to go back to the point I was discussing with Justin, to demonstrate to the Americans that we're genuinely sharing the burden and genuinely worthwhile allies that can help protect America's interests if America, for whatever reason, is diverted elsewhere. I strongly believe the United States, including under this president, remain committed to the defense of Europe. But of course, we must always be ready to defend ourselves. And Article 3 of the NATO treaties tells every nation, we always think about Article 5, tells every nation we need to have our own national defense plans as well. And of course, that goes for the collective of European NATO too. And we have to step up to that set of responsibilities.
Do you think, Mark, an example of that, slightly outside the NATO context for the moment, but is Ukraine, that when we saw an initial view from the US administration that they would not take on-the-ground troops post whatever war there was, what peace there was, that Europeans began to say, well, we will be there?
And I think we have to be. I think we have to be. And that is a reasonable position for an American administration to take. The European position, again, the right one, is that we still need American support. We still need American, that incredible intelligence and other capability to enable us to do that kind of thing effectively. And I think that is a legitimate part of burden sharing. As I say, I actually think, let's not forget, during President Trump's first term, he actually increased the number of American forces in Europe. So we tend to caricature it sometimes, but they actually increased American forces in Europe. They actually delivered the first lethal aid to Ukraine. But defense is not about planning only for the likeliest, let alone the most desirable contingency. You've got to plan for contingencies that are much more challenging. And it could simply be the case that the Americans are drawn to deal with a problem elsewhere, a crisis elsewhere, even if they leave some forces, have to redeploy forces in order to deal with that. And we have to be ready that a future Russian, this president or a future Russian president doesn't take advantage of that in order to attack European NATO and can be deterred from doing so.
Sorry, thank you. Hi, everyone. Sarah Sloan from Cisco. I just wanted to go back to your opening remarks, and thank you so much for your time. You talked a little bit about industry engagement around national security matters. Could you expand on, I guess, where you've had success and how you've motivated private sector around national security matters?
So I think it's a great question, and it's particularly the case as the national resilience agenda becomes more prominent. So traditionally, we tended to think of critical national infrastructure as being the absolute core functions of the state: defence, intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. We have to realise in a modern, highly connected economy of the kind that we all have now, that critical national infrastructure involves the mobile phone networks. Obviously involves power and water and other utilities of that kind, but it also involves the food retailers. And therefore, in many ways, the most significant elements of national infrastructure, critical national infrastructure, are now in private hands, certainly in the UK. And so we have to engage those sectors in a conversation about resilience. If you wanted to disrupt food security in the UK, you'd probably go after the mobile phone network, because all of the big retailers have just-in-time food deliveries going out to all of the supermarkets and so on. And those just-in-time food deliveries rely upon the telecommunications networks, and the telecommunications networks, mobile and landline and the super fast broadband and all the rest of it are provided by private companies. And so one of the things that actually I think we're very proud of in the UK is our most secret agency, GCHQ, created an entirely open and public-facing unit, the National Cyber Security Centre, to engage with citizens and industry on cyber threats, because that's obviously a route into this. And I think that's a model, that they did engage with these big retailers, they did engage with citizens in enhancing our cyber security. So there's an obvious resilience and defensive element to this. And there's some other elements to this that are perhaps less strategic, but nevertheless significant. We're also encouraging many of those companies that are essentially part of the national resilience infrastructure, critical national infrastructure, to sign up to the military covenant and to give reservists among their employees the right to meet their reserve commitments without having to take annual leave and so on to do it. And many of them are doing that as well. So actually, I think if we look at that side of it, we're in good shape. Never be complacent, always lots to do, all of that. But fundamentally, the relationships are there, and I think the understanding is there that they have this. This is part of their responsibility. Of course, it's one of thinking of sort of the more active kind of deployment in extending our interests beyond our borders and with allies. It is inevitably more complex, and it's in that area where I think in defence and defence tech is probably where we have the relationships we need. BAE Systems, you had Charles Woodburn, the chief executive of BAE Systems here. He has AUKUS absolutely front and centre in his mind and recognises, as a big private sector company, he has a central responsibility in demonstrating the benefits of AUKUS, not simply being a deliverer of certain components of it, and is really preoccupied with Pillar 2, for example, about which if he were here, he'd be able to talk at length. I think we need to take that kind of model of a relationship, which in a sense is natural in a defence company because we're the customer and those relationships are very deep, and extend it out into other areas, in particular for frameworks like AUKUS, where national security and national governments are so heavily engaged. Other than that, though, of course, a lot of it is simply about providing the frameworks and then letting the private sector do what it does best, which is doing business in other countries and building the relationships and developing the resilience. And that's partly the free trade deal with India I would see as part of enabling that, and then letting the private sector get on with it without directing it. But there are clearly elements where government should be playing a more active and hands-on role.
I'm conscious that people will also want to enjoy asking you some questions off the record, and you and the High Commissioner and the team will enjoy talking to us Aussies about the British lines victory, I'm sure. Thanks for not mentioning already, Mark. Is there a final question from the audience?
Thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. Just a really quick question. You've talked a lot about the importance of strategic alliances, and I think at the moment there's a little bit of a disconnect between public perception of those alliance systems and the important role that our national security infrastructure places on them. And you've seen results in recent Japanese and Korean elections highlight that. And I just wondered what from a national security perspective and apparatus can we be doing to strengthen those relationships, but also to highlight to the populations of allies the important role that those relationships play for the world that we currently enjoy?
Great question, and of course, people sometimes ask that question in the context of the United States, and in particular the questions over tariffs and so on and so forth that we're all kind of wrestling with at the moment. The truth is that the professional relationships, the defence, security, intelligence, and in many cases the economic and other relationships continue essentially almost irrespective of the politics. And the politics, that's not that they're operating without democratic supervision, but the politicians actually want, our political leaders want us to continue to develop the capability relationships and so on in the way that we do, and indeed want us to mature and extend them, particularly in in the current era. So as professionals, I think in a sense, our job is simply, or your job, I'm now kind of on the touchline, but those of you on the pitch, your job is just to get on with it. And the job of people like me who've now moved to the touchline or the commentary box is to remind our publics of the importance of doing that. Of course, we've got to respect the outcome of democratic elections. And so if Japan or Republic of Korea decide for a period they're going to take a different course, we have to respect that. But part of our job, again, is to maintain as best we can the professional relationships and, of course, to get the sanction from those democratically elected governments to continue to do so, continue to develop joint capability and so on. And so, for example, the GCAP program, which is a program of cooperation to build a 6th generation fighter, which is a UK, Japan, Italy collaboration, may involve others at some point. I would certainly, if I were in government, be leaning very hard. I'd be probably on a plane to Tokyo saying, we are just going to keep going with this, aren't we? And I think our sense is that that kind of program will continue. But in the end, we've just got to keep working at it. I think the sort of second part to your question about engaging our publics, and it sort of goes to the ambassador's question about the public engagement with these issues, is a really interesting one. I've just participated in a podcast in the UK put together by Sky News called The War Game. Some of you might have heard it. I'm a minor player in it, so I'm not this is not completely an advert. I think they've done a really good job on it. But the idea of that was to find a way of engaging the public in understanding the threats that we now face. That's framed around an attack from Russia, but of course one could make the case in other scenarios as well, in a way that sort of brings it alive for them and sort of acquaints them with just how vulnerable we could be if we don't invest in defence and upgun our capabilities and so on. And in a way that doesn't simply involve people like me sitting on a news programme and saying it's very important that we do this, but actually brings it alive for people. And I think that was a very creative way of doing that. And I think we've got to think of creative ways, particularly in the social media era, of engaging the public, engaging your generation in these issues in a way that tunes into the way that they do engage with the news, they do engage with political issues, that isn't simply the old-fashioned way of having retired generals and ambassadors going on the TV and sort of sounding like their grandfathers lecturing them, but actually engages them in the debate. And generally, governments are a bit clunky at that, which is why actually I think it probably took a journalist in this particular case of the podcast to put it together. But I think we've got to get a lot smarter at that, and that's perhaps how we tackle the 16% question that the ambassador put to me earlier as well.
Mark, thank you. I do want to ask you one last question.
Shares privilege.
Given that's right. You had multiple roles in Afghanistan. This month is 4 years since the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Yeah.
Now you had left office as National Security Advisor the year before the withdrawal, so you weren't in government at the time. But what went through your mind, given everything you had put into Afghanistan, and where do you see the situation 4 years on?
I think, like everyone who committed time to Afghanistan, a mixture of anger and sadness, and basically, I still retain that position. It was a mistake. It was a very bad mistake, that decision. Of course, at some point we had to draw down, but we'd already drawn down very significantly. I believe that we had an opportunity about a decade earlier to have negotiated a political settlement to Afghanistan when the Taliban were on the defensive, and we actually we could have pushed for a settlement where they would have had no choice but to accept a collective government that would have brought together the Afghan government, the legitimate opposition, and the Taliban insurgency. I failed to win that argument within the alliance. There was a feeling at the time we could just keep going and there might be a military solution. That was a mistake. But certainly then, essentially, coming out precipitately and removing from the Afghan security forces all of the enablers on which they relied, which essentially just flipped them back to being a militia rather than a genuine security force, because we took away their air cover, we took away their medical support and so on as well, I think was a catastrophic decision. And I think some of the language that was used around criticising them for not staying in the fight was shameful, actually. They right the way through the campaign experienced much higher rates of casualties than any of us did, and both Australia and the UK experienced actually a very high level of casualties ourselves. And I think the big lesson of Afghanistan, I think there are two. One is Clausewitz was right. War is the continuation of politics by other means, and if you're in that kind of civil conflict, there is only ever a political solution to it. You can't solve it militarily. You can't solve it through security measures alone. You have to have a political campaign with a military element and a civilian element and an economic element and so on. That's the first big lesson, and we know that in Ireland, and we know that from elsewhere. And the second big lesson is you have to have strategic patience, because the Taliban had this brilliant insight, which they used. You have the watches, we have the time. If you allow that to be true, then you're always going to fail. So you have to have the strategic patience. You have to recognize it's going to take time. You have to commit for the long term. You have to stand behind whatever settlement you're able to negotiate and underwrite it. And I believe, had we done that, Afghanistan would look very different today. And it is, in my view, a shameful choice that we ran out of patience when we knew what the right answer was, and we weren't prepared to maintain that commitment. And by the way, we weren't experiencing any casualties, so it wasn't as if we were continuing to put our own people at risk to achieve that. We were beyond that phase. We were enabling the Afghans to do that, and I think we could have got to a political settlement that would have been very different. It would have been fragile. It would have been messy. It would have been very Afghan, but it would have been a lot better than the outcome that we had now.
Well said, and hopefully it might be a lesson for us all around the world in terms of the need for, as you say, strategic patience, including in relation to support for Ukraine.
Agreed.
Lord Mark Sedwill, thank you very much. Please, everyone, join me in thanking
Mark
for the.
Thank you. Thanks very much.